Hello dear viewers, my name is Anton. I am an attaché of the Russian Embassy in South Africa. As part of our work on preserving the memories of the liberation struggle in Southern Africa and the role that the Soviet Union played in it, we are conducting a series of interviews with the veterans of the African National Congress and South African Communist Party. Today we have the pleasure of interviewing former Chief of Intelligence, the armed wing of African National Congress, Umkhonto we Sizwe, who later on held three ministerial positions in the governments of Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki, Comrade Ronnie Kasrils. Comrade Kasrils, thank you very much for making yourself available for this interview. You are, of course, a legendary figure both for the Russian people and the South African people. Larger audience knows you primarily thanks to your autobiographic book, Armed and Dangerous: My Undercover Struggles Against Apartheid. Thanks to this book, we know that you are actually a grandson of one of the first immigrants from the Russian Empire to South Africa. So, when growing up, what was their attitude towards the Soviet Union in your family?
Well, the grandfather you refer to on the paternal side came to South Africa from Vilnius, Lithuania, in the 1980s, prospecting for diamonds. I had never really met him because he passed away very soon after I was born. But on the maternal side, my grandfather and grandmother on that side were from both Lithuania and Latvia. And it was that particular maternal grandfather who I grew up with. He had come to live in our house after his wife died. And he taught me a little bit of Russian. He wasn't very political. The Jews who came to South Africa in the 19th century, as elsewhere, basically to improve their economic positions with greater opportunities, because in the Tsarist Empire, of course, there was huge discrimination, and also fleeing from the Tsarist pogroms. They didn't really speak very much about the Russian Empire, but I detected in him some pride, and in discussions with him as I grew up, he spoke quite lovingly of Russia as such. On my father's side, he was born in Vilnius, but came to South Africa in the year 1900. He was brought here by that prospecting grandfather of mine, Nathan, on the paternal side. And also, the family weren't political, but they were working people. And that gave me a feel for working people, and from my mother particularly, her concern about the treatment of black people in South Africa. The thing that I recall about my father was that when the Russians put that first Sputnik into space, I must have been something like 15 or 16. And he was very excited and somewhat proud. And every evening we would go outside to watch the Sputnik traveling through the night sky. It was a cousin of my mother's, whose family also came from Lithuania, who was in the Communist Party of South Africa. I barely knew her. She lived in Durban and we were in Johannesburg. But when the Sharpeville massacre took place in 1960, that's when I was determined to join in the liberation struggle. I'd been quite a rebellious schoolboy and I hated racism. So I was able to go to see her, and it was through her, rather than my own particular family, that I gained an introduction to both the Communist Party and the African National Congress in 1960.
Oh. So once you joined the ANC, as we know from your book, you were actually one of the first members to be sent for training abroad to the USSR. You were just 25, around 25 at that time. Is it correct?
Yes, just actually about that, 24 going 25.
Do you know why ANC chose USSR to train its members? Did it try approaching other countries for that purpose?
Well, initially the ANC had access to Ethiopia, to Egypt, and then Algeria in terms of training our people in Africa. But these countries didn't have the incredible resources of the Soviet Union. That's number one. Number two is that the Communist Party of South Africa had a long experience from the time of its inception in 1921. And then the ANC through the 50s, there was an embassy in South Africa of the Soviet Union in Pretoria. And the ANC comrades, as well as the illegal communists, because the party had been banned, had access. And that embassy represented the Soviet Union and was very popular amongst the liberation movement people and leaders, some of whom traveled in the 50s illegally to the Soviet Union, to other East European socialist countries, and even China, at invitations to attend conferences and so on. So there was this attraction to send people to the Soviet Union for its politics as well, because the ANC people, the people of South Africa generally, really were inspired by the position of the Soviet Union as the first socialist state in the world, Soviet Russia, and its stance in terms of support for African struggles, the independence movement against colonialism, which of course began in earnest after the Second World War. And there was that attraction. And when they found that the leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was extremely and immediately responsive to the requests made by Oliver Tambo on behalf of the ANC, that those first, the first training from 1963 in terms of military training and experience was undertaken. The Communist Party already had access to Soviet training in terms of the political field.
So you also mentioned that the victory of the USSR in the Second World War, which is also in Russia known as Great Patriotic War, was also a factor. Was it much talked about in South Africa in those times? The fact that USSR was able to defeat the most strong military machine in Europe, which was Nazi Germany.
Well, very much so. The Communist Party grew tremendously through that period because of the role of the Soviet Union in opposition to Nazi Germany and fascism. And people in South Africa followed this very closely. And the lessons of that struggle and the victory over fascism inspired people to a tremendous degree.
So in 1964, you first arrived to Moscow, to the capital of the leading socialist country in the world. What was your impression of the city?
It was incredibly exciting for all of us. As we flew into land at the Moscow airport, we were already seeing the snow. We were arriving in winter. That was extremely exciting. And the whole energy of the capital, the people we met, the military people, the Communist Party officials and so on, were so welcoming and hospitable. We stayed for quite a few days in Moscow. Because I was with the leadership of MK, Joe Modise, who's the commander, and Moses Mabeda, who was the commissar. So we met quite a lot of people and saw the sights. And by then I'd been in the Communist Party of South Africa as well as in the armed struggle from its inception in 1961. So we were educated, of course, in Marxism, Leninism, but the history of the Soviet Union and its songs and so on were very close in terms of our experiences. So one had read a lot as well, and it was immensely exciting.
And did you see any of those stereotypes that there was a harsh, maybe economic situation, or bread queues, or something like that?
Not at all. I mean, Moscow was booming. It was prosperous. Of course, the people who we engaged with were very quick to tell us of the battle to overcome the poverty of Tsarist towns and the fact that the whole empire, and Russia included, was a prison house for the workers and the peasantry. The losses sustained just under 20 years before we arrived in 1964, 19 years after the victory over Nazi Germany. There was the massive engagement in recovery and reconstruction. We could see this taking place. But to compare this, especially for the African comrades who came there, unlike Bele Chileverka, the white comrades who, all of us, had a privileged position within South Africa, even if my parents were more working class. And this is what you have to gauge for Africa, the racism, the oppression and exploitation of the black masses who lived in incredible poverty and the most squalid conditions. For them to see a city like Moscow was like arriving in paradise, especially when they found that there were white people who treated them as equals and with great hospitality. And they were sleeping in hotels until they arrived in their training centers, where they were trained by white officers of the Soviet Union and of course waited on by cooks and waiters, women and so on, who looked after them. For them, white people who were treating them as equals, as human beings, was absolutely incredible. I must say for myself, to witness this was very exciting and inspiring as well.
So from Moscow, you moved on to Odessa, where you did training in military engineering, if I'm correct.
Well, it was all-round training for partisan warfare, for guerrilla warfare, for clandestine conditions, but we also had specialization. So some specialized in infantry, others in artillery, others in commanding the guerrilla detachments. Because of my background in sabotage activities in South Africa, and with Modisi and Mabida, we arrived a bit late. The others, approximately 150 strong from Tanzania, South Africans, ANC, Communist Party comrades, had been already in Odessa for a couple of months.
So were you trained in using armaments, weapons, light weapons, artillery?
Yes, a whole range of weapons that one would encounter in guerrilla warfare. So the iconic AK-47, which everybody was in love with, light machine guns, heavy machine guns, mortar, grenades. We even learned to drive T-34 tanks because of the perspective in guerrilla warfare that it comes a time when you're able to obtain heavier equipment, including tanks and Grad-pair rocket missiles and so on, from the enemy, or being supplied from abroad. So one went through all of that in terms of the equipment, and then in terms of the tactics, from ambushes and raids and so on, in guerrilla warfare.
Do you still remember how to assemble and disassemble AK-47?
Well, I carried an AK-47 with me for another 30 years or so, and I still have a licensed, I must say, Makarov pistol for self-defense in any conditions.
So in Odessa, you were trained by Soviet officers. You were in close contact with them. Were they treating you well? Was it like a friendly relationship?
Absolutely, absolutely. They treated us as absolute equals, although there's obviously a difference between the people training, the instructors, and the people who are learning. So we learned discipline, we respected them and so on, but they were extremely humane, egalitarian, the idea of communists. They taught us the politics of Marxism, Leninism, the politics of guerrilla warfare, the question of the supremacy of the political over the military, and the values and humanistic aspects. So they were incredible in this respect. They never lorded it over us. Our comrades never felt that we were subservient to bosses. We could speak and raise any questions and feel at ease with the Major General who was in overall charge of us, as well as the polkovniks and so on, the majors and everybody else who were engaged in the whole project.
Since Odessa was part of the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, when you were training there, did you notice any nationalist sentiment among the officers or the population? Because currently, under the current regime in Ukraine, this sentiment is very much rife. It is actually being promoted by both the West and the Kiev regime. But back then, did you notice any sort of nationalist sentiment?
Absolutely not. The people who trained us, the instructors, came from all over the Soviet Union, from many different republics, Soviet republics. I can remember particularly our political instructor, Major Chubinikan from Armenia, as an example, who was totally equal, as everybody was, to Russian officers or Ukrainian Soviet officer corps there, and those who served us, as I mentioned, in terms of the logistics, the food, the cooking, etc., and the ordinary people, because we were very free to interact with people on our weekends in the city of Odessa, and there was never any reactionary sentiments of racism, of looking down on us, of projecting an idea that there was a difference, contradictions between Ukrainian Soviets and the rest, Russians, Kazakhstanis, Armenians, and so on. What we didn't realize, and in retrospect, given the pro-Nazism of the current Ukraine regime and those others, such as in Lithuania or Latvia and the Baltic states, which I know of, which are so pro-West and NATO and cover up the crimes that were undertaken by their collaborators, that one came to understand and learn in our political classes that we needed to be very aware of the danger of reactionary collaborators with racism and fascism. And what would be mentioned would be the ugly episodes in that very Ukraine, especially in the western part, of the Banderist fascists, Nazi collaborators. So that aspect emerged, in which we were taught that any struggle against racism, oppression and exploitation, fascism, the capitalist system, that those striving for justice had to be very vigilant against collaborators within our midst, and of course in relation to that national question. So there was a lot of discussion in the political classes about the national issue in any struggle for revolution, including in the colonial countries seeking independence, in terms of the national democratic revolution or the struggle for socialism. That was embedded in our minds, and we watched wonderful films about the partisan struggle, about the Great Patriotic War, and in many of the films selected, there were such sequences of that Nazi-style collaboration. So I remember a film we saw about a great heroine of mine and the Soviet people, Zoya, who was that young Russian-speaking schoolgirl in Kiev, who at the outbreak of war could have gone to Moscow to study at university, but chose to join the partisans, and how she was betrayed, the role of collaborators, and her capture by the Nazi monsters, torture and execution. And one of the things I loved about Moscow, because I've been there many times, is the statue in the Moscow metro of Zoya, a great heroine of the Soviet Union and of Russia today, and how absolutely barbaric it has been by the Zelensky Kiev regime to have dismantled the statue of Zoya that stood in Kiev and replaced it with that fascist monster Stepan Bandera.
Oh, it's very good that you mentioned that you mentioned Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, because apart from being an able intelligence officer, you actually were a bit of a poet, because we've seen that you've written a poem dedicated to Zoya called Zoya on Guard. And you actually used your alias when you published it. It was A.N.C. Kumalo.
My alias, the pseudonym. Yeah, I used to write some poems as A.N.C. Kumalo.
Yes, it is a beautiful poem, and do you still remember this? This poem?
You know, coincidentally, I have one of my sons is currently traveling through Russia, and the other day he was in Moscow, and he took some photographs of Zoya in the Moscow metro and sent it to me. And if we have a chance, I'll show you on my mobile phone when we've completed the interview.
Is she still as beautiful as you remember her back in 1964?
I think in my mind there is an ongoing romance with this wonderful Soviet heroine who gave her life not only for the Soviet Union but for humanity, because that victory over Nazism, over fascism in the Great Patriotic War is something that saved humanity and directly contributed to the inspiration and the impetus of the independence struggles of Africa and Asia at the end of the war, because of the overthrow of fascism, which would have enslaved humanity. And it's a lesson for us today, in the world today, because of the threats of a world war and of the rise of fascism, of reaction once again.
After completing your training in Odessa, you returned to Dar es Salaam, to the ANC office. When continuing your work in the framework of liberation struggle, did you use the skills that you acquired in your training in the USSR, and did you maintain the links with the Soviet people, with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union or the Solidarity Committee?
That earlier period created the base, the groundwork for further development. And the initial training of the 60s was fundamental, was practical. It was put into use in terms of the offensive of MK, of operations, of battles. We were able to test our training in the heat of action against the enemy, and it gave our fighters tremendous confidence. It's not that things were easy, because we didn't have a real internal base in South Africa. With the arrest of Mandela leadership in the early 60s, we were operating from outside, and until we were able to re-establish our political base inside the country with the mass activity which started taking place essentially in the 70s and then particularly the 80s. So we were able to realize how important the politics were in our initial training. But that was so invaluable that it wasn't as though we closed the door on further interaction with the Soviet Union, later the German Democratic Republic, and of course Cuba, a lesser extent China at that particular stage. So training continued, and the training that initially was in Moscow, which was the first training in 1963, including Chris Harney's training there, and then Odessa 64-65, the Soviet Union, through the Communist Party and the Ministry of Defense, had opened up a major training base for all the liberation movements of Africa, I would say, in Perevalny, in the Crimea. And that became the main area, along with Moscow, and then other parts of the Soviet Union, Frunze training, Baku in Azerbaijan for naval training, and so on. Frunze in terms of commissars and pilots in later period. And that training was enriched through the interaction between the Soviet trainers and, of course, the MK of the ANC, Frelimo, MPLA, the Zimbabweans, the Namibians. It was flourishing, and it lasted throughout from the 60s, the 70s. Some of these movements became independent as a result of the support of the Soviet Union at training and other socialist countries. Angola, Mozambique, as I've said, Zimbabwe in 1980, Namibia by 1989, 1990, and then South Africa 94. Throughout this period, and particularly up to the collapse, unfortunately, of the Soviet Union of 1991, that relationship, it was enriched and improved, and in the end, there were thousands of people, freedom fighters from Africa and elsewhere, thousands and thousands being trained in the Soviet Union in terms of its internationalist duty, as it put it, internationalist solidarity, and the struggle against imperialism, racism, and capitalism.
You mentioned that there was a problem of bringing trained MK and ANC members to South Africa, since ANC, being banned in South Africa, did not have a base there. In this regard, we wanted to ask you about a curious operation dedicated to solve just that problem. It was called Operation Aventura. As far as we know, you were actually the one of the people responsible for organizing this operation. Could you tell us more? What was it about? What was it designed for? How was it prepared?
Yes, well, precisely as you've said, the ANC faced in the 60s and early 70s this huge problem of comrades who had the military training, political training, clandestine training, of returning into South Africa itself. It was very difficult. We were based very far from the borders of South Africa. Up to the time of the collapse of Portuguese colonialism, all the countries of Southern Africa were under colonial, racist, imperialist rule. So to return comrades from as far as Tanzania and even Zambia, which became independent in 1964, through a cordon sanitaire of the South African, Portuguese, Rhodesian racists, was incredibly difficult and highly dangerous. So people returned. Many were ambushed on the way back. Many were arrested who managed to cross the borders into South Africa because the underground, as I've mentioned, had been smashed. So the ANC had a conference in 1969, the Morogoro Conference, dedicated to finding ways to recreate the political underground in the country, to revive it, to build it, so that those who were trained abroad, in coming back into the country, through all the obstacles I've mentioned, could be received in a safe and secure manner. the operation Aventura was an operation, I would say, the brainchild of Joe Slovo, who was a leading comrade in terms of ANC operations, and of course a leader of the Communist Party, together with Oliver Tambo, the president of the ANC, and Moses Mabhida, who I referred to as the commissar who I trained along with Joe Modise in Odessa. And they came up with this idea of, thanks again to the Soviet Union, a connection with the Saidi Barre new government that had come to power in Somalia, and managed to get support and commitment from that country in terms of receiving trained cadres. And by that time, these were cadres who had been trained already in the early 60s, whether Moscow or Odessa, who had received now further training in Baku in terms of landing from the sea on South Africa's coasts. And the idea was, in terms of Aventura, a ship, a particular yacht which could carry 50, 60 people, together with the crew, purchased with money provided by the Soviet Union for the ANC, who then purchased this yacht in the Mediterranean, at a port in the Mediterranean, and were able to recruit a crew. In the first place, a Polish crew who were in exile in Poland. The guerrillas, some 25, came from Baku and received their final instructions from Tambo, Slovo and Mabhida, and boarded the yacht to sail out of Somalia down the Indian Ocean to land off the coast of South Africa, in fact the Transkei. I was involved for a whole year before the attempted landing with deploying a team of recruits who happened to be from the Communist Party of Britain, including a Greek comrade, Alex Mombaris, who, under our instruction, entered South Africa as tourists, took holidays, fishing holidays down the coast, videos of the coast, photographs, reconnaissance of possible landing points, reported back in Britain to myself and at times Oliver Tambo, and certainly with Joe Slovo. And we collected a possible 30 landing points along the coast. We reduced this to 3 possible landing points, in the end to 2. And that was decided as the potentially A point and then a fallback to B point, close by the points in the Transkei, near Port St. John's, a minor resort in South Africa, but in a very remote part of the Transkei itself. I then sent back 2 groups of 3 people each who were at these points, had equipment, had hired vehicles, had already dug DLBs, where weapons which would be brought aboard ashore would be buried as caches, armed caches, and they were waiting for the landing off that ship by small dinghies of this group of MK comrades. We had specific dates in mind. I established a communication with these teams in South Africa while I was in London, and between myself and Joe Slovo in Somalia. So everything was ready from the point of view of the reception of the combatants. It was a very big project, not easy to organize. It had to be done with very tight security, starting with the training in Baku and the purchasing of the yacht, obtaining the crew, vetting them and so on, all with the cooperation of the Somali revolutionary regime. An enormous project which took a full year to bring to hopeful fruition. And I remember in London receiving the information that the project, which for communication purposes we called Mother, that Mother was well and on holiday, and I was able to, using communication means, to alert the chief of the reception units, which was the Greek comrade Alex Mombaros, to be ready and with particular dates in mind. You can imagine the tension all round in Somalia among the leaders of our struggle, especially the comrades of MK, of Mkonta on board, and of course the crew who were risking a tremendous amount in their own safety and had to be very committed. And then the reception party inside South Africa. I've never bit my nails, but I came close in that period. It was very tense. I was in constant communication. It was a very, very well organized communication, secret form of communication, basically where we could phone on safe phones using everyday language about Mother and her happiness and that kind of simple language which never would arouse suspicion. Unfortunately, and it's the history, that the boat Aventura, after leaving the port in Somalia and being at sea for a couple of days off Kenya, developed engine trouble and had to come back to the point of disembarkation from Somalia. I had to inform the reception groups in the country that Mother was ill and was just recuperating, and I would let them know when she was available and healthy again. So it was put off for about 1 month. In that period, the crew had come under suspicion by the Somali government, who felt that there could have been deliberate sabotage of the engines of the Aventura. And this is still an open question. There are various angles to this. It's possible that maybe a member of the crew, which was, say, about 8 people, might have become very scared and carried out some act of interference with the engine. It's quite easy. Or the engines just didn't stand up to the voyage. So there are 2 viewpoints, and I have spoken to the comrade who was a British comrade who worked closely with us, who was involved in business and who purchased the boat and had the ball bearings from the engine examined at a certain point, which was sent back to him in Europe. And from his point of view, the report was that there was just a defect in the engine. On the other hand, there's quite strong belief that somebody sabotaged the works. However, those involved, both the MK comrades as well as our leadership, were determined to carry on with the operation. A quick investigation in Somalia was of the view that the boat was okay. And we were able within weeks to recruit from British communists, internationalists, seamen who were prepared to carry on this particular project, because the former crew couldn't be trusted. And they were initially held in confinement by the Somalis until it could be proved whether they were actual people who had sabotaged this operation or not. That couldn't be proved. So they were repatriated to where they had come from. They were exiles in Poland after the coup in Greece, the colonel's coup, by the way. So you can't really, I feel, point a finger there. The new crew from Britain were so courageous and got on with the task of checking through the engines, the whole boat, its navigation system, etc. They felt confident that they could carry out the operation to fruition. I again received news that Mother is going on holiday again. I alerted the teams in South Africa. They were relieved. They wanted this operation to work so badly. And off Mother went on holiday. They were informed. Again, after 2 days, the boat came to a halt. The engines ground to a halt off Mombasa. Oh, I think this time, that was the first time, two days out from Somalia, and had to be towed back. And that led me to send, I'll never forget the sadness of sending a message to Alex Mombaris. Mother has died. Please return for the funeral. That was the sad end to an operation which showed the incredible determination of the ANC, of its leaders, of its MK comrades to return to South Africa. It showed the huge support of the Soviet Union, and in this case, of course, that Saidi Barre regime in Somalia, who was prepared as an African state to give assistance. So it showed the enormous commitment to international solidarity. And, you know, to the fore was the Soviet Union. This operation was so symbolic of everything that the Soviet Union assisted us in doing. In struggle, you have success, you have setbacks, you have advances, you have retreats. This goes for any struggle. It goes for any tactical operation. It goes for entire strategies. It goes for entire epochs of struggle, of humanity against injustice, for freedom of people. And we've seen this happening on a world scale. We see a revival now, I believe, even in this period where humanity, and if we talk about the Palestinian people, the struggle against NATO in Ukraine and in Europe by Russia, and struggles elsewhere of the peoples, of the black and Hispanic peoples in the United States, the struggles against the revival of fascism in Europe, the struggles of the people of Cuba, of so many countries, of the Palestinians, first and foremost at this particular time. So our experience, including of the Aventura operation, is we never give up. We know, as the term goes, you know, 2 steps forward, 2 steps backward, 1 step forward, whatever, to learn from setbacks and to keep going, because we never give up. This is the example of the Soviet Union in the war that started in June the 21st, when the Nazi hordes invaded the Soviet Union, and there was huge retreat and setback, only for recovery in terms of the commitment for a stand of all the people against fascism, against reaction. And I'm an optimist in the sense that humanity always finds a way for revival against any form of setback, including what we're facing in the world today.
As Chief of Intelligence, you actually became the one who was also responsible for choosing the candidates who would now go for training in the USSR. What were your criteria when you were choosing the cadres to be sent to the USSR?
Well, we of course had to know the candidates. We judged them on the basis of their commitment, their reliability, their discipline, and to be as sure as possible in relation to such choices. We had to do that in terms of the recruitment of those internationalists I referred to. You can never be 100% sure. There were people who we depended on, who actually examples of them becoming or having been infiltrated into our midst. This is something we learnt to be vigilant about, as I reported to you, in the Soviet Union, wherever we train, GDR, Cuba, and so on. But those were the sort of criteria that one has to take into account in terms of judging the character of a human being.
So ultimately, apartheid was defeated, but today, South Africa continues to, the majority of the population of South Africa continues to face a very vicious enemy who is, maybe you can say that it is an invisible enemy, which is the harsh socio-economic conditions. And just like in the past, many South African youngsters, they continue pursuing studies in Russia. They acquire new skills, new knowledge, and return to South Africa and try to improve the situation in the country. So just to end this interview on a high and positive note, could you give sort of an advice to all those young people who wish to study in Russia and explore our country, get the knowledge, and return back to improve their own country?
Well, look, of course, in the first place, the younger generation all over the world have to understand the history of their own people, the conditions of their own people, what is holding their society back, because under capitalism there are enormous challenges and obstacles, including the brainwashing that the population are subject to. So the question of learning from the past and learning from the great richness of experience in theory and practice is vital, which is why we project and teach as much as we can the history of such struggles all over the world and the correct theory of Marxism, of Leninism, of analyzing the world in order to change it, as Karl Marx made clear, and all those who have seeded him, including leadership in our own country from that particular period. Also to understand that in any country there are very powerful forces holding the country back, its real sovereignty and independence and ability to overcome the problems faced economically, socially, in the former Soviet Union and in Russia itself. And that affected our ability in South Africa and the neighboring states, all the countries that received that support from the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union had collapsed and expired, and Russia under Gorbachev and then Yeltsin was playing into a Western hegemony and seeking a development which could never assist Russia or any of the Soviets in terms of their economy, there was a huge regression in the world, and that affected our capacity in South Africa, where we became dominated by the former colonial system and the imperialism headed by the USA. So our youth, whether Russia, whether in any of the former republics of the Soviet Union, whether anywhere in the world, needs to understand that the struggle today is against the imperialist countries headed by the USA and with NATO as its vehicle, attempting to re-establish their control, because Russia now, together with China, together with the progressive forces of the world, and you find them particularly in the global south, are making huge headway. And from that point of view, Russia is now a different place. It's recovering. And this, together with China particularly, is altering the balance of forces again in favor of popular advance. And this is where the future lies, and what we have to educate this new generation about in terms of who can provide all of the countries of the world the assistance as we once received in the 60s. And when I say that, I'm talking about countries from Cuba to Algeria to Tanzania to Angola, Mozambique and Ghana and so on, Latin America, India, the Asian countries, the countries of Western Asia, so-called Middle East, in their struggles, the Palestinian people, for sure. And this is the possibility. That's why to rebuild the anti-imperialist forces, and through that rebuilding to be able to educate in many ways from many different sources, including Russia, of the right path of advance is to create a better world. It is the mission of those of us who are still alive to pass that knowledge and inspiration on to the new generation of youth.
That's a very wise advice. On a more personal note, could you tell us more about the medal that you have?
Okay, well, this medal was presented to me through and from the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, and by Comrade Slava Titiakin, who in this house personally presented the medal to me, and I wear it proudly on an occasion like this.
It's very beautiful. Another very interesting page from your biography is the fact that when attending a youth conference in Bulgaria, in 1967, you had a chance of meeting Yuri Gagarin,
yes.
The first man to go to space.
I shook hands.
You shook hands with
him. Shook his hand.
How do you remember him? What impression did he make on you?
A rather quiet, very composed human being who had lovely sparkling eyes. And he was with the Soviet delegation. It was a huge conference of youth, and I went to him to personally introduce myself and to shake his hand. And we had a few moments of pleasantries as I wished him well. It was a very so shocked when he later died in a accident. And every time I've been to Moscow, I always love to go to see that monument to his heroism.
Thank you very much.
Спасибо вам.